All right, first things first. Okay, first things first. As you know, the quarter ends Friday. Some teachers are cutting people off on Thursday. I'm giving you full time. All right, just letting you know. Yeah. All right. If you want to have anything in, you have to have it in by 3 o'clock on Friday. The other reason why I'm not cutting you guys off is we have a game on Thursday night. I wouldn't be able to get it off, cut you off anyway because I got to take off. So I plan on giving you Friday as a day to get makeup work in. So just FYI on that. But when you leave, we're done. I'm not doing all that. I got too much to do this weekend coming up. I'm traveling all day Saturday, and I got to do family stuff I got to do on Sunday. So when I leave on Friday, what your grade is what your grade stays. So if you don't have it in, it ain't going in. All right. That said, this is a long section. I would like to get done with it by the end of next week. I know we're not going to get done with this by the end of next week, but that's the hope. I'd like to be done with this chapter and testing and getting moving forward. Oh, and please don't do what one of my genius sophomores swears up and down that they have sent me stuff. The stuff where it's a comment, you do understand at the bottom instead of submit, there's like a reply button. You gotta hit and then submit it. They didn't do that, and they're like, oh, and they still had the tab open, so luckily they didn't lose anything. So, all right. Okay, Egypt. Now, I know it should be a shock because every civilization we've talked about so far has sprung up around the river, and this one. Aren't I the rocket scientist? Okay, technology is great when you actually plug it in. Okay. All right, just like Mesopotamia, it pops up around the river. Now, the Nile isn't the longest river in the world, but it is one of the widest and the deepest. And at some parts, when you look at it, it actually looks like a big freaking lake because you can't really see the water moving, but it is ginormously huge. I mean, it would make the Mississippi look kind of like a creek. All right, now, and if you do look at a satellite picture of Egypt, it is literally, you're looking at nothing but brown, and then all of a sudden, green right by the river. You get too far away from it, you are out in the middle of a freaking desert. Which actually kind of blows me away because you got your civilization here. You go a little bit farther this way, and you're in the massive jungle where you have all kinds of food and stuff like that. I don't know why. Who knows why people settle where they do. Okay, anyway. As this is a test question, so I'm going to go over it. The thing that made the Nile really easy to farm around is they knew exactly at what time every year it was going to flood. When it would flood, it would go out to all what you see as the green area. It would water the ground. They could use it predictably to farm. This area is very easy to grow things in. And they also learned how to cut canals where they could bring it out even farther. And that goes under the part of where it kind of looks like a lake because the water is standing and can be pushed out. This big canal right here was dug out. And if you remember when we were talking about the Exodus and the Jews, they believe this is the canal that was dug that allowed when everything else was going, when everybody else was in famine, because the rivers were overflowing. This kept the Nile from overflowing way too much, and they were able to grow everything and that food. Okay. And this is just, harvesting time. It's rolling down real low, and then it comes up. It's planting. So, yeah, everything's on good. Okay, now, this is the thing when I was your age screwed me up so much because everybody thinks of north as up, right? When we talk about Upper and Lower Egypt, the part of Upper Egypt is actually higher up land-wise. Like you didn't know water runs downhill. All rivers are going downhill. So this is actually Lower Egypt because it's the lower ground, not so much the lower as far as north-south. And if you didn't, and it makes sense with all of the cities of ancient Egypt pop up along the Nile River. And here's the other thing. They got real easy transportation. Where the Romans had to build roads, they just hopped on the river and went up and down. Okay, we already talked about this, but this is all going to come down to Pharaoh being a god king. He's the top of a pyramid, no pun intended, because the Egyptians love pyramid. But then you have nobles and priests. This is the first time we see priests really high up here, but we'll get into that in a minute because death is everything. The skilled workers are up here, farmers who always kind of get everything that sucks. Then you've got everybody else and slaves. All right. This is a picture of a man who, according to Egyptian religion, his name was Osiris. He was the first great pharaoh. He is believed to have been killed, and then his body was mutilated. The goddess Isis, and that's who this is supposed to be here. She's one of the few goddesses that doesn't have a animal head. She comes and saves him, puts him back together, and then he then rules the underworld. And I guess he's blue because when you die, you turn blue. But he is the symbol, and he is the god. He's the god of the dead. And when you die now, you go to see him. And then because of him, all of his descendants are now god kings. All right. We'll get to those in a minute. But we still don't have any freaking idea how they did this. These are the oldest standing structures, and they aren't going anywhere anytime soon. Okay, now if you look at their gods, there's a few that look human, but most of them are going to look like this. They're going to have a crocodile head. They're going to have a tiger head. They're going to have all different kinds of things. We've already talked about hieroglyphics. It's a picture language. You can make sounds, but it took two letters together to make a sound. So spelling things out took you way longer than it does with an alphabet later on, that would later on develop. And this, another test question here. The reason we are able to understand what the Egyptians were because we didn't have any clue what this was. When Napoleon goes down and tries and takes over Egypt, one of his archaeologists he takes with him finds this. This has hieroglyphics up here. This has Greek right here. I'm sorry, hieratic, which is modern Egyptian language, and then down here is Greek. So because they knew these two, they could translate this, even though they just had a very limited part of it. their understanding of astronomy was amazing. And they used the stars to set up and build things, like everything was perfectly north, south, east, west. We still don't know how or why they built this thing. Because this thing is like 1,000 years older than the pyramids. Or at least it's thought to be. Then there's all your guns again. If you look at him, he's always dressed up like a mummy. And this is where the mummification would come from. Now, the funny thing, their creator god, Atum, is really not that big of a deal. They don't talk about him much. Ra is one of the most important ones because they're farmers. He's the sun god and falcon-headed god. Anubis is the god of the underworld and then he's the judge of the underworld. So this is also the weird part. When he got mutilated, and his little brother tried to take power, the belief on Osiris is they cut his manhood off, and they never did find that again. And it fell in the Nile River, and that's what makes everything so fertile around there. So the sign of fertility is also the sign of Osiris. The thing you use for fertility, the little fertility sign, goes back to ancient Egypt for Osiris. Did we talk about that? Okay, talk about that. Now, they could get out on the Mediterranean, but they were not good sailors. Matter of fact, the first time they get taken over, it's just by AC people who basically kick their butt. And the ancient Egyptians are saved by geography. They don't have a lot of people around them, so nobody really took them over. That's why they lasted so long. Because usually when they got into a big battle early on, they got their butts kicked. They lost to the Assyrians because the Assyrians had chariots and the wheel and bow and arrow and would take them out. You can build pyramids, but you can't build an army. Okay. Now, way back here, this is like the first civilizations. This right over here is when summer was popping up. And if you see shortly after, these are when the two big periods are. And now, if you're looking at this timeline, in the time of this timeline, here's what happens. The Babylonians pop up, the Persians pop up, the Assyrians, the Greeks, all these massively huge cultures come and go, and Egypt just keeps trucking along. The Roman Empire Romans start about right here, and it isn't until after halfway through the Roman Empire that the the Egyptian Empire finally ends. It lasts for over 4,000 years. I mean, Rome lasted 2,000. That was pretty amazing, but we got 4,000 years. Now, there's the Old Kingdom. This is when they're building pyramids. This lasts the longest. Then you have the Middle Kingdom. This is when they were digging the tombs underground. And then the New Kingdom, that's Ramses the Great. That's when they're building all kinds of stuff. But basically, this is the biggest empire. This was kind of small, and this is when they united the upper and lower. And then later on, after the Greeks took them over, they got their independence, but then it's be called the Hellenistic. This is where, like, Cleopatra comes in. She's like half Egyptian, half Greek. Why are the pyramids built? Anybody know what the pyramids are? You call the aliens in, so they can help us build stuff? Yes. And here's the messed up thing. Now, just to give you an idea of how big a pyramid is, if you went up to the football field and went from end zone to end zone, you'd be about 2/3 of the way across the pyramid. That's the base of that thing. It's completely perfectly square. It is ginormously huge. I forget how many billion tons they think of rock is in this thing, but they're made out of blocks of granite and marble that are like this big, that weigh close to 15 tons each, And how they picked those suckers up there, they got them there, we to this day have no clue. We talked about all that before. This is just a quick thing. We're going to go this is it. Okay. All right. Now, pharaohs from the very early on are the first, and I don't like the fact that we leave Egypt for last, because basically the only one that starts before Egypt was the little city-states of Sumer, because shortly thereafter we have Egypt. So all those empires, like I said, came and gone while Egypt sticks around. Now, they are the absolute ruler. To question them is to question God, and you don't question God. They are the earthly embodiment of Horus and the son of Ra, the sun god. That's why, if you've ever seen the movie Prince of Egypt, that's why I say I'm the rising sun, I'm the morning sun, and the something moon, and basically their life and death. They, once they become pharaoh, become a god. Okay. And because they're out in the middle of nowhere, nobody ever really bothers them. Okay, now. This is the first time you hear of, remember when we talked about Sargon, they tried to give to one son, but then it ended up being generals that took over. The Persians were always about generals. The Babylonians never really had a succession. This is the first time you see kings and kingdoms being handed from father to son. Now, if you did not have a son and you were pharaoh, women were not allowed to sit on the throne very early on, like in the Old Kingdom and the Middle Kingdom. Women could not sit on the throne. It wasn't until the New Kingdom that we allow women to sit on the throne. If you were a daughter, your husband or your son would take over as pharaoh. And no matter how much land you owned, technically the pharaoh owned it all, and he could take it back at any time, which really sucked for the rich people. The only people who were as important as the pharaohs were the scribes, because they were the only ones who could read or write. Okay, now legal traditions. This, when we get into life and death, the process of mummification, this is going to make more sense, because everything that the Egyptians do is preparing to die. I don't know if you've ever been around an old person who is like close to death and all they're doing is waiting to die. From the time the Egyptians could understand things, they were preparing to get themselves mummified, preparing to go to the afterlife. All they worried about was dying, which was really kind of a messed up society. Because what Mat is, it is, are you a good person? Are you doing good things? Because when you got to the afterlife, what happens is Horus would be down there and he'd be on a scale, and he'd put a feather on the scale against your heart, and if your heart was light and nice, the feather would weigh more, and you got to go into the afterlife. If not, you would wander around and like haunt people for the rest of your eternity. Now, they did not. Anybody ever seen that really bad movie, Brendan Fraser movie, The Mummy? So it comes up. Have you seen it? Where this guy's bad and he hooks up with the pharaoh's wife, and they both get the worst punishment you could get wasn't dying. It was that they were going to kill you, and you could not be mummified, because if you couldn't be mummified, and we'll get to this in a minute, you couldn't go into the afterlife. So to put you into a thing like have these flesh-eating bugs, they would put you in a mummy case, and they throw you in there, and you'd just be eaten alive, and then you'd have no body left. This is kind of Hammurabi Code. Like if you committed rape, they would cut off the part that allowed you to do rape. If you stole, your hands were amputated. So they do kind of steal from Hammurabi over here. By the way, the Hammurabi Code was around when this happened. One of my favorite ones is they take you out and throw you in the Nile. They, alligators, I'm sorry, crocodiles, usually congregate and they're like, what is it? Like pack animals, like wolves. And they would find like a little lagoon where they would hang out. And then if you were going to be executed, they had like this big long platform there. They just throw you out there and just let watch the crocodiles devour you. And if you were like in crime with some people, they throw you out one at a time so that people could watch the person before they get killed when they were going to be done. And death by crocodile is not going to be fun because crocodiles don't like eat you like a lion would eat you. What they do is they grab you, they roll you, so they're actually going to try to drown you first. They get you down there, and then when you stop fighting, then they eat you. So yeah, it's not going to be a fun. Okay. Okay, ladies, I'm sorry, but almost every society we're going to talk about until we get somewhat into halfway through Rome is men are everything. Women aren't seen as much other than possessions. The men are going to be the head of the family. You can have more than one wife, but women can only have one husband. The jobs we've already covered. But basically, life was good. Everybody had a job. The economy of Egypt thrives. Women, they were well treated, and you did have legal rights, which is way better than what it was in summer for you. Because you could divorce your husband. You had to have like 2 or 3 witnesses that it wouldn't treat you very good, but then, yeah, you could. You could own your own property, which was different from the rest of the world. But basically, your job is to run the house. Okay. Agriculture makes up most of their wealth. That's all the same with all these ancient countries. They have so much food. Many times Egypt gains strength and gains power because they have food when a lot of places don't. People come down. That's the whole story of the Exodus. Basically farm production. But what they don't tell you about the economy is one of the biggest money makers in. Okay, guys, you need to push on this. One of the biggest money makers in Egypt that kept the economy going was the death industry. If you were a funeral director, you were freaking loaded because you made all kinds of money because, like I said, people saved their whole lives to get made into a mummy and to have a tomb that wouldn't get robbed because you had to have a tomb that was awesome because if people could break in and tear up your mummy. And if you're wondering why, when we get into the pyramids, when we get into all these tombs, when people rob the graves, which was another big job of the economy, because there's all kinds of treasures there. The reason you destroyed the mummy, you think, okay, why would you bother the dead person? The reason you destroyed the mummy is because if you went in and robbed their, in the Egyptian belief, if you went in and robbed them, if you didn't destroy the mummy, they would haunt you the rest of their life. So if you destroyed the mummy, they had to stay. The ghost had to stay in the tomb and then couldn't go in the afterlife. Okay. Okay, we ready? Yeah, this is okay. Yeah, I'm not going to go this way. Talk about this. All right. Talk about Buddhism. Should just skip those early ones. Okay. Here we go. Equilibrium, Mat, the symbol for the goddess Mat was the scale where they're going to weigh your heart. Hence the feather. Her feather is what you got weighed against. Your heart got weighed. That's why they took the heart out, so it would be easy for them to weigh it, because they thought your soul literally stayed in your heart. Okay, now, when you die, if you were poor and you were an Egyptian, you got what they call natural mummification. They would take you out into the desert. They would take what little you had, all your possessions, they would bury them with you. Remember how people say you can't take it with you when you die? The Egyptians didn't believe that. They believed what you had when you died is what you kept. Now, they would mummify you, usually just wrap you up because if you were poor, you didn't have the ability to be mummified. But when you were mummified, basically, if you just died out in the middle of the desert, you almost get mummified anyway because it's so hot and dry out there. So they go out and stick you in the sand, your body dries out and stays in one piece, hopefully, with you and your possessions, and you get to go into the afterlife. Now, if you had a little bit of money, you'd get a tomb. Now, when they went to mummify you, it is a process that takes about 40 days. The first thing they're going to do is they're going to lay you out on the table, they're going to cut you open, they're going to pull out all your internal organs. They got these little jars with heads on them, called canopic jars, and they're going to put all your organs in there. They're going to kind of like pickle you. If you know how to make pickles, when you take cucumbers and stick them in vinegar and they become pickles, they have basically vinegar. They're going to put your stomach in one, they're going to put your kidneys in one, they're going to put your intestines in another one. Your heart, that's the main one. They take that and put that off to the side. I will get back to that. Now, do you know the one organ that they totally thought was completely worthless? Yeah, the brain. Now, here's the cool thing, and I don't know how they did it. What they would do, okay, she's dead. They put her head back. They had this long, looked like a spike, a flat metal spike. But on the end, it had a hook. They would take this thing, they would stick up her nose and take a hammer, and there's like a solid membrane up in your nasal passage that's flat. You have to break through that. Yeah, you guys get a headache now, right? And they were with this little hook, they were able to pull your brain out in one piece. Because they believed if you damaged the skull, you would damage their ability to go into the afterworld. And these people were able to pull out the brain in one. Like I said, they thought the brain was totally unimportant. So then they just threw the brain away. But they knew if they didn't throw it away, it would rot your head, so we had to get rid of it. Now, once they got all this stuff out of you, they take your body and they put it in this white powdery stuff called natron. And what natron does, if you ever worry about getting ashy or having like dry skin, this is like takes all the moisture out of everything. They throw you in the stuff and leave you there for 40 days, and you basically wither up, and your skin becomes like hardened leather. And at that point, they've also soaked your heart in natron. They open you back up. They put your heart back in because your heart's not important, but it's wrapped up like a mummy. And then after you're all done, then they, put you like this. They wrap you all up with bandages, and then you are now ready to be buried. Now, they put you in, depending on how wealthy you are. If you're not very rich, you get put in one casket. If you're really rich, the richer you are, the more caskets you get. If you know anything about King Tut was in 5 caskets. One of them, the last one being gold, solid gold. Then he had 2 sarcophagus. You know, the big things that surround it. He had 2 of those. Not to mention a complete solid gold death mask. I don't know if any of you, it was 2 years ago, right before COVID popped up, they had the big King Tut exhibition down in the Science Center. Did any of you go to that? It was way cool, wasn't it? Now, they didn't have the actual death mask, but they had a replica of it. And it was like 24 karat solid gold. It is worth a couple of billion. Just because it's so old and so, it's unbelievable. Now, then, while they're doing all this stuff to you, there's a priest just sitting over you the whole time, reading from the Book of the Dead, doing these chants, da 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 da. And one of the things that people don't know when they make the mummies, the first layer of bandages all have spells written on them for in the Egyptian religion. They get you all that. Now, then they take all your stuff and your mummy and they go out and they put you in your tomb. Now, here's what they believe. If your tomb stays hidden, this is awesome because then you get to go down and see Osiris. He takes you against Mot's feather. He measures the heart, how good your heart is. If you've done good, Mot, your heart is light, so the feather will weigh more, and then you get to go in the afterlife. Everybody's happy. Now, if you've been bad, you now are trapped to roam the earth. Now, your corpse, the reason you wanted your tomb to not be broken into is if anything happens to your mummy. Like, okay, say they're making you a mummy, and then while you're there, they break your arm off because you got so dry, just like they're trying to move your arm, all of a sudden, snap, it comes off. Now, when you go to the afterworld, you don't have an arm. They believe that your soul completely represented your physical self at your death. Does that make sense? I know it's weird, but okay. Now, you were buried with a book of the life, which would take you into the next world. Like I said, if your mummy is destroyed, you have to come back and stay in your tomb. And that's where you spend the rest of eternity, which would really suck. Okay. Okay. I'm not real sure which one's which. I always get them backwards. It's believed that you actually have two souls. You have the Ka and the Ba. The Ka is, it's both kind of the same thing. It's like a copy of the exact same thing. The Ka stays with your body, which they kind of get screwed because they have to stay in your tomb for the rest of eternity. And the Ba gets to go to the afterlife. Although they experience the same thing at the same time. I don't understand it, but okay. One of the other things for your bedroom, they would give you a little key. They'd wrap it up in your money, and that was your key to get into the afterlife. If you weren't rich enough to get a key, I guess you didn't get to go to the afterlife. Okay. Oh, this is what I just told you. Should have just. Okay. Now, the longer they could cook you out in the sun and in the natron, the better chance your body had of surviving. If you were Pharaoh, some pharaohs would be kept in the natron up to 100 days. They did find that if you got past 100 days, it became counterproductive because then your body was so brittle they couldn't move your mummy and then your arm would break off. The Middle Kingdom, that's what I was talking about with King Tut. The death mask was to get an idea of what you look like so you can be recognized in the afterlife. There's a mummy case. It's basically just a coffin, but it's really pretty because it's got all these drawings all over it. There are your canopic jars. That's a test question. This is where they put your organs. So the only two things, just so you know for the test, that don't go in canopic jars are the heart, because that gets put back in you, and the brain, which they thought was worthless. Now, when you see this term 3,500 years, that sounds okay. You have the old kingdom, and then they kind of fall apart for about 100 years. Then they come back. Now, Egyptian culture is still there. They're just ruled by somebody else. Does that make sense? Then they do the middle kingdom pops up. Then they get taken over by other people, and then they last. Now, this also does not include the last almost 1,000 years that you had mixed Egyptians, half Greek, half Egyptians ruling. So, yeah. Now, all of these things, geography, the fact that they're away from everybody, politics, the belief that Pharaoh is God. You don't have a lot of people rising up against the king because they believe he's a god. The religious structure keeps things in place. These are some of the smartest people around. The economy's strong because they have grain to sell. Yeah, everything's stability. Nothing changes really for close to 4,000 years. Uh, talk about that. I already talked about that. Now, when you see these trade routes, don't think that the Egyptians were the ones that came and got it. The early Phoenicians, and then later on the Greeks, are the people who come and trade with the Egyptians. The Egyptians don't like getting in boats because when they get in boats, they tend to sink. They were very fearful of the Mediterranean. Talk about that. Okay, now, this is what's totally cool to me. Now, if you look at this, and by the way, there's as many theories on how the pyramids were built than there are for anything else. You know, you get people on History Channel who think the aliens built them. You get, there's a guy that thinks that there were like rock there and they just cut it, and that's how they were able to get there. Because how these people were able to do this, we have tried to build these things, and we can't figure it out. The most we can think of is there was like a huge ramp, and they kind of just drug them up there and pushed them around because, again, I remind you, these people do not have the wheel. When you look down here, there's no wheels. They're just shoving these things up the hill. Now, there is a belief that they cut canals because here's the really weird thing. The limestone that you use to build these things, these massive tonnage of rock float. Limestone has like a porous system in it that holds enough air that they actually kind of float. And they think that they cut canals, and they kind of drug them up that way. I don't know. I don't have any flipping clue. There was a scientist who went out and was able to bring limestone, because the limestone was brought from like 500 miles south of where the pyramids were built, up the Nile River. He was able to bring limestone up there on just a very small boat, and it worked, although the canoe was like very unstable. And you got to remember those crocodiles floating out there, so if you tip over, you're lunch. Okay. But the Old Kingdom is when they're building the pyramids. Now, New Kingdom, this is where you have dynasties. This is where Thebes becomes the center of it instead of farther south down. It's more up towards the delta. This is where you start having all the canals built, more and more farming. So when the tombs move inside, they start painting. And this is also where we have the Valley of Kings, where we get King Tut. This is where they go out the cliffs, start cutting the side of mountains and finding caves, building tombs there, and then covering them, hoping that their mummy would not be desecrated, their tomb would not be robbed, because religious beliefs don't change. Now, the Middle Kingdom ends when the Hyksos come in and take over. We don't know anything about the Hyksos. Hyksos just simply means the sea people. You know, people came from the sea. We know they weren't the Greeks, and they basically come and wipe out the Egyptians. Now, there are people who believe, remember I told you they moved the ancient Israeli timeline back. They think that the Hyksos were actually, that was the Exodus when Egypt was so devastated when all of their slaves left, their economy crashed. Either way, there were people with chariots, and they basically wiped them out. So when you watch the movie The Ten Commandments, that's not right that the Egyptians have chariots, because they did not. They were wiped out by everybody who had chariots in the world. New Kingdom begins when the Hyksos get kicked out. This reestablished Egypt as the central government. And this is as big as Egypt ever gets. And here's another reason why they don't think that ancient Israel, there's no way that Moses could have happened in the New Kingdom, because in the New Kingdom, Israel has already been taken over by the Egyptians. This is under the rule of Ramses the Great. Okay, now, You had a god for everything in ancient Egypt until this guy. Oh, sorry, not this guy. There, come on. Okay. Okay. This guy. This guy believes in one God. It's the sun god. Now, this also happens after the Israelites have been moved out. So monotheism has been in, but he doesn't believe in the God of the Israelites. He believes in the sun as the one God, Ra. Everybody should worship the sun and nothing else. He irritates a lot of people by doing this. He kills off a bunch of priests. Anybody who doesn't want to agree with him is heavily taxed or punished or killed, and they get enough of it. And this is the first time we hear of that this guy, that a pharaoh is rose up against and killed, but he is killed by his own people. Now, the only thing that was really good about him was his wife, Nefertiti. Nefertiti can't take the throne, but she rules as pharaoh for her son, Tutankhamun, later on. And she is a very popular ruler. Her son, you'll know of because that's King Tut. He doesn't rule for very long, but we know we're very excited about him because that's the first pharaoh that we found their entire tomb intact. But basically, he basically shuts down the whole nation because the whole idea, and here's the big thing. While he's pharaoh, because he does not believe in mummification, they stop the whole process. Now, this is at this point, about a 2,000-year belief system of mummification, the afterworld, the gods. When you cut that off, people are going to get mad, and that's why they rise up and they kill him. We have found Nefertiti, his wife's. By the way, his body was so mutilated that you could not. They literally took different parts of his body and threw it into different parts of the Nile where he'd be chewed up by different alligators, so his soul had no chance of going anywhere in the afterlife. They really hated him. Okay. And then their son, King Tut. This is what you would have seen if you went to the Science Center. That's the death mask. That weighs about 60 pounds of solid gold. And it is about that big. There's his golden casket. It's not solid gold, but it's like bronze with gold laid over the top of it. It weighs about 2 tons. This is what's believed he would look like. There's his sarcophagus, his main sarcophagus. It goes inside of that one. That's the thing that flipped over on the top. There's his throne for the afterworld. There's his canopic jars. Now, he's 10 years old when he becomes pharaoh. His mom kind of rules, Nefertiti rules for him. He basically rules for 9 years. We think his brother took him out and killed him. But the thing that he's remembered for is, one, we have found his tomb, but two, he returns all of the Egyptian gods to Egypt and gets rid of what his dad and with just the sun god. Now, you got to skip ahead to the new kingdom where we're Ramses. This is the greatest pharaoh of all of Egypt. He is the builder king. He builds cities. He builds temples. He builds all kinds of stuff. He actually builds a temple for himself. This right here, this is a temple so people could go and worship him. You would think, okay, here's a god, here's a god, here's a god. No, those are all statues of Ramses. In this temple, there are over 400 statues of himself. So he thought he was all that in a bag of chips. Okie dokie. That's all I got for you. Okay, I'm about